Hello everyone and welcome to part 3. There's a lot to cover in this part because a lot of history was covered, and so I've split this into parts A and part B. We're going to be covering not just Exodus, the next book after Genesis, but we're going to be covering Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy because they all work together. Now, when we think about it, there are two important strands. First of all, there is the story of Moses, the rescue from Egypt, the journey to the promised land, which because of various failures on the part of the people of Israel took 40 years. That's one strand. The second strand is the giving of the law, the Ten Commandments, to Moses on Mount Sinai, and the outworking of that law through those 4 books. So, as I said, there's a lot to cover in these 2 sections, part A and part B. But I hope you enjoy and I hope you learn a lot from it. Thank you. In this first part, part A, we're looking at Moses, the rescue from Egypt, and the wanderings in the wilderness before the final entry into Canaan, the promised land. We left part 2 with Jacob and his 12 sons settling in Egypt. Of course, that's not where they were meant to be. They were meant to be journeying to the promised land. But life was good. Their son Joseph was second in command to Pharaoh, and they were well looked after. But that was not to last. A new Pharaoh came, and who was threatened by the amazing way in which Israelites bore children, and they became a threat. They began to outnumber the Egyptians, and so Pharaoh issued an edict that all male children, Israelite children, should be killed. And so our story begins with the rescue of one of those Israelite children called Moses. We begin with a familiar story, but then it becomes an epic story, and we'll try to tease it out because it's not easy, because you don't get the whole story by just reading the book of Exodus. You've got to read the other books as well to piece the story together, and so that's what we'll try to do. And I hope it's helpful. I hope it helps us to work it all out. I'm doing my best, but I hope I'm very clear. So, without any more from me, let's begin. Just to remind ourselves, in this part A, we're going to look at these 2 interweaving themes. I'm going to look at the rescue and wanderings in this part, and then in part B, the giving of the law. Well, we left, as I said, Jacob and his 12 sons in Egypt. And as we begin chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, we see that they're becoming a threat. They've grown and they've multiplied over the number of years that they were there, quite a long number of years, and they're outnumbering the Egyptians. And so a new Pharaoh comes to the throne, very powerful Pharaoh after a period of Egyptian weakness, and he begins to deal with the threat by telling the Egyptian midwives to kill all the male Israelite children, boys, and they disobey. They say, Israelite women have children so easily that they're very infrequently called, and so he makes it a law. But of course, God, he didn't reckon on God's plan and God's purpose for his people. What makes the story very difficult is that the people, having been rescued miraculously from Egypt, from slavery, taken into the wilderness to go on their way to the promised land, constantly rebel. And so the whole story becomes incredibly complicated. But we'll try and unpick that story as we look at the chapters. But the whole story is spread over not just the book of Exodus, but we've got to look at Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers to make sense of it, and we'll try and weave our way through that. Chapter 1 begins, as I've said, with the Israelites in Egypt. Chapter 2 is the birth and early years of Moses. His mother, who we don't know her name, has the idea of making a basket, covering the bottom with tar, and floating baby Moses in the bulrushes near where she knew one of the Egyptian princesses came to bathe. Egyptian princesses look at this lovely baby boy and her heart melts, and she takes him into the palace. And in chapter 2 we have Moses growing up with all the privileges of living in Pharaoh's palace, and but still knowing that he's an Israelite, because his sister has been his nursemaid, and as has his mother, and they've taught him who he really belongs to. One day he's out visiting the Israelites and sees an Egyptian overseer cruelly treating an Israelite, and he kills him. And so Moses has to flee, and he flees into the wilderness. And it's in that wilderness that he has the life-changing encounter with God in the burning bush, where God declares himself as I am, and that he has heard the cries of his people, and Moses has to go and rescue them. Well, you can understand how Moses felt. He makes all sorts of excuses, but in the end, having been given Aaron, his brother, as a helper, he goes to Pharaoh. And so we're in chapter 4. Between chapters 4 and 11, Moses goes repeatedly to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh refuses to let the people go. And so there is a series of 10 plagues. At the end of it, the final plague is God, through Moses, says that he will kill the firstborn of all Egypt. That's sons, animals, everything. But he tells Moses, as Moses leaves Pharaoh's presence, he says to him, this is what I want you to do. And so the command is given that each family is to slaughter a lamb and paint some of its blood on the lintel of the entrance to the house, so that when the angel of death comes over, he will he will pass over the Israelites' houses, and they will be safe, and then they will be led out towards the promised land. They haven't been left long when they come to the Red Sea. Impossible to cross. God causes a miracle to happen, and they pass over the Red Sea, and so pass over again, pass over the Red Sea, dry shod, and get to the other side. The pursuing Egyptian army is drowned in the Red Sea. They then begin the epic journey to Sinai, which is the mountain between the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea, and a long journey as they are travelling towards the Mount Sinai or Horeb, they run out of food and they start to complain against God. He's led us out into the wilderness and is going to leave us here to die. But God provides manna each morning. There's a dew falls on the ground which they are to gather, and that will be their food. Not long after, they begin to complain that they haven't got any decent water. They're in a desert. And so Moses is commanded to strike a rock, and fresh water gushes out. So God provides two things, but it doesn't stop the people grumbling. And as they journey on, they start to grumble that manna is getting a bit boring. And so God gives them the gift of quails. So they then have meat and bread and water. When they get to Mount Sinai, God calls Moses up into the mountain, to the top of the mountain on his own, and there God meets him in a very dramatic way. And God gives Moses the Ten Commandments, which he's written with his own finger on tablets of stone. But Moses is gone for a long time, 40 days, and in the meantime, the people who are settled at the bottom of the mountain get bored and start to frolic around. And they build themselves a golden calf because they want a god who they can see to worship like the Egyptians had. A total non-understanding. And this is part of it, that God is forging a nation out of really a slave rabble. And as we'll see as we go on, that takes some doing. Eventually Moses comes down and sees them at their revelries, and there's a great commotion, and a large number of them are swallowed up in the earth. Moses has then to go again to the mountain and be given the commandments for the second time. He's also given instructions about the law and about worship. And the next, really, the rest of Exodus covers those things. In chapter 24, towards the end of Exodus, God makes a covenant. And we'll talk about covenants again in a few moments. We have to jump over to Numbers next to see the finish of the journey. In Numbers, they have the first anniversary. And shortly after that, spies are sent out to look at the promised land. And they come back with grapes and wine and other offerings. And they say, this is a land flowing with milk and honey. It is a goodly land. Now this land is Canaan, and so they are told to enter Canaan, and in fact they're told to conquer Canaan. But most of the spies actually say, oh, they're very fierce, they're very strong, and won't go. There's only two of the band that actually are urging to go over and to conquer the land. God is so angry with their cowardice that he says this generation shall not enter the promised land. And so Moses is bid to lead them back into the wilderness, where they wander around for 40 years before eventually that generation had died out. And God says, okay, Moses, try again. And so we leave these books on the edge of the entry into Canaan. But we'll cover that when we cover the book of Joshua, which will follow on in this series. So the timeline is quite long, from around about 1590 BC, when Jacob and his family enter into Egypt. The exile, the Bible says, is 430 years, which takes us down to something like 1280 when the Exodus occurs. And there are another 40 odd years. You know, it's roughly around about 1250 when they begin the conquest of Canaan. But it isn't a simple matter. So we have these dates, and they're all very approximate. Where you can't be sure. But it was a period when the rest of the known world, there, the civilized world, if we can call it that, was in somewhat in turmoil. Now, the world at the time of Exodus, we're really in perhaps what is called one of the golden periods in the history of ancient Egypt, the 18th dynasty. And one of the great pharaohs, Ramesses II, he's the one that you see many of the temples and that he built at the time. He was also building store cities, and that's something that may hark back to the Joseph story of storing the grain in the good years. It may be something that the Egyptians continued to do. So it looks like the slaves were employed, if I can say that, in the building of these great projects of Ramesses and his successors. Now, there'd been a very unsettled period when a foreign race had ruled over Egypt called the Amarna. But there's also, when you look at some of the ancient writings that have been discovered in Egypt, that there were some nomadic people called the Habiru or Hapiru, who kept raiding and bothering Egypt, and they were dealt with quite severely by the Egyptians. Now, it's not a big stretch of the imagination when you think of Hapiru, think perhaps Hebrew. So it may well have been that there were lots of these tribes, but the biblical one seems to be the one that actually frightened the Egyptians the most. In the north, the Hittite Empire is in conflict. It's broken up. There's a lot of weak states fighting amongst themselves, but no dominant power or empire. Now, there are two key themes I want to draw out from this part one. First is the 10 plagues, the killing of the firstborn males. It was such a seismic event in Israelite history that it was remembered, and is still remembered year after year in the Passover festival. They had to slaughter the lamb, paint its blood on the lintel post of the entrance to the house. They were to stand dressed and ready. They were to eat the lamb with unleavened bread, bread that would last, so they could take it with them on their journey, and to be ready to leave, which they did. No small undertaking. Probably at least 100,000 people we're talking about. A mighty leaving. And of course, Pharaoh, who'd allowed them to go because he'd suffered the death of his eldest son, the heir apparent, quickly changed his mind and chased them. But the army was destroyed in the Red Sea. After a year or so's wanderings, they come to Mount Sinai, and God makes a covenant with them. And the covenant, as I've explained before, is strictly this, that God says, if you will obey my commands, I will bless you and protect you. If you disobey my commands, I will punish you. And we see this worked out throughout the rest of the Old Testament, that God's people are constantly transgressing God's laws, and then moving into a period of punishment in one form or another, and then repenting before God, and God restoring them and bringing their fortunes back. But we'll explore the law as I said, in part B. Now, the early Christians found rich references to Jesus in the Old Testament, and here's just two. Passover lamb. Remember that John the Baptist, when he sees Jesus, says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." But he sees in Jesus not the lamb sacrifice that will have to repeat it again and again and again, but the final and perfect sacrifice in God's only Son. And the New Testament writers, looking at the law, saw that in Jesus' death and resurrection, he achieved what the law could not do, that he fulfilled the law. And we'll look again a little bit more about that in part B. They also see that Jesus is the instigator of a new covenant that was promised through Jeremiah, that the old covenant was worn out, it wasn't effective, and that in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, there's a new covenant. And that was something that launched Christianity away from Judaism into a completely new beginning of God's acting with his people now, not just the Jewish nation, but the whole of mankind, who would own Christ as their Lord and Saviour.